a small cabin deep in the mountains, there lived a woodcutter who cared for his elderly mother. Though he was poor, he had the warmest and kindest heart of all. Every morning, he rose early to climb the mountain and cut firewood, and every evening, he sold the wood to make a humble living with his mother. One bright spring day, the woodcutter shouldered his wooden frame and headed deep into the forest as usual. While he was busy chopping wood in a grove full of oak trees, a sudden, loud noise broke the calm of the forest. Looking up, he saw a deer running toward him, panting heavily. Its eyes were filled with desperation and fear. "Please, hide me. I beg you." Hearing the deer's pleading voice, the woodcutter quickly covered it with branches and grass. Moments later, a hunter appeared, clutching a bow and arrows, breathing hard. He looked around and asked, "Did a deer come this way?" Without a moment's hesitation, the woodcutter pointed in the opposite direction. "It ran that way over the ridge," he said calmly. The hunter hurried off without suspicion. When he was gone, the woodcutter gently helped the deer out of its hiding place. The deer bowed deeply to him in gratitude before disappearing into the forest. The woodcutter felt a warm sense of pride in his heart. He believed he had done nothing special, only what was right, cherishing the life of even the smallest creature. Then, with a quiet smile, he returned to his work. A few days passed after the woodcutter had saved the deer. He had almost forgotten about that day and was back to his usual work in the mountains. It was a warm afternoon, and the sunlight gently filtered through the leaves. As he wiped the sweat from his brow and took a short rest, he suddenly sensed a familiar presence nearby. Turning his head, he saw the same deer he had rescued standing before him. The deer's clear eyes sparkled with gratitude. Slowly, it approached the woodcutter and bowed politely. "I could never forget the kindness you showed me when you saved my life," the deer said softly. "I've come to repay your grace." The woodcutter waved his hands modestly. "That's not necessary," he said. But the deer continued, its expression growing serious. "Deep in this mountain," it said, "there is a mysterious pond. On nights when the full moon rises, heavenly maidens come down from the sky to bathe there. It is a sacred place." Then the deer lowered its voice and shared a secret. "When the fairies bathe, hide one of their winged robes. The fairy who cannot find hers and return to heaven will become your wife." The woodcutter was startled, but he listened carefully to every word. However, the deer added solemnly, "You must never show her the robe until she has borne you 3 children." The deer then carefully explained the path to the pond and repeated its warning once more. The woodcutter nodded quietly, promising to remember. Satisfied, the deer turned and disappeared silently into the deep forest. One night, when the full moon shone brightly in the sky, the woodcutter carefully followed the path the deer had told him about, venturing deep into the mountains. After walking for quite some time under the silver moonlight, he came upon a clear, mysterious pond that shimmered with a magical glow. Around the pond bloomed beautiful flowers, their gentle fragrance carried softly by the breeze. The woodcutter hid behind a large rock and waited quietly. Before long, a brilliant light descended from the heavens, and beautiful fairies floated down on clouds. Laughing softly, they laid their delicate winged robes on the rocks by the pond and stepped into the water. Silver droplets sparkled in the moonlight as they played and splashed, their clear laughter echoing through the forest. The woodcutter held his breath, mesmerized by the sight. Among them, one fairy seemed especially graceful and beautiful. With a trembling heart, he crept closer to the rock and carefully hid her pink-winged robe in his arms. After some time, the fairies finished bathing and came out of the pond. One by one, they put on their robes and ascended back to the heavens except for one fairy who couldn't find hers. "Wait, sisters. My robe is gone. Please, wait for me," she cried. But the others said they could not stay any longer if they didn't return before dawn. Terrible things would happen. One after another, they rose into the sky on their clouds, until only the youngest fairy remained, frantically searching and weeping by the pond. Unable to watch any longer, the woodcutter stepped out from behind the rock. Startled, the fairy turned toward him in fear. "Please don't be afraid," said the woodcutter gently. "Come with me. I will take care of you." With no way to return to heaven, the fairy followed him with a heavy heart down the mountain, and together they walked toward his humble little cabin. The fairy began a new life in the woodcutter's small cabin. At first, she often felt sad and homesick, longing for the heavenly world she had left behind. But as time went on, seeing the woodcutter's sincere and gentle heart, she slowly opened her own. Every day, the woodcutter cared for her with kindness and devotion, and his mother treated the fairy as if she were her own daughter. As the seasons passed, the fairy was deeply moved by the woodcutter's warm heart and his devotion to his mother. Though they lived in poverty, she saw genuine happiness in the way the woodcutter and his mother loved and supported each other. In time, the fairy decided to become the woodcutter's wife, and the two were married in a simple but heartfelt ceremony. From that day on, everything the fairy touched seemed to flourish. Their once poor household slowly began to prosper. The following spring, they were blessed with a beautiful baby girl. She had her mother's bright, clear eyes and her father's warm smile. The little hut was soon filled with the sound of the baby's laughter. A few years later, a healthy baby boy was born. The woodcutter held his children in his arms, one after the other, his heart overflowing with joy. The fairy became a loving mother and a devoted daughter-in-law. She told her children enchanting stories about the heavenly world, and the woodcutter worked even harder to provide for his family. Each evening, the family sat together, sharing meals and laughter. Their humble home overflowed with warmth and love. The woodcutter still remembered the deer's warning, but as the happy days continued, he began to forget it little by little because he trusted and loved the fairy with all his heart. Happy years passed, but deep in the fairy's heart, there always remained a longing for the heavenly world. Whenever she looked up at the night sky, she remembered her sisters in the celestial palace and the days she used to walk among the clouds. Though she had grown fond of her life on earth, there were times when she dearly missed her winged robe. Late at night, she would quietly gaze toward the heavens, letting out a wistful sigh. Watching her sorrow, the woodcutter's heart ached. At last, he brought out the robe he had hidden away and placed it before her. "My dear," the fairy said softly, "please let me wear my robe just once more." The woodcutter hesitated, suddenly remembering the deer's warning she had only borne 2 children. But when he looked into her pleading eyes, his heart grew weak. After a long struggle, he decided to trust her. Overjoyed, the fairy took the robe in her hands. As she touched the soft, familiar fabric, tears welled up in her eyes. At that moment, a gentle glow began to surround her body. The fairy called her 2 children, who were playing in the yard. When they ran to her, she hugged them tightly in her arms. The children looked up in wonder at their mother's beautiful robe. But then what a surprising sight! With her children in her arms, the fairy spread her shining wings and soared up into the sky. The woodcutter reached out desperately, but his hands grasped only the air. The fairy and the 2 children grew smaller and smaller, until they disappeared into the white clouds above. The woodcutter stood frozen, staring blankly at the sky. Just moments ago, his wife and children had been with him and now they were gone without a trace. Only then did he remember the deer's warning, "Do not return the robe until she has borne 3 children." He had forgotten those words. Falling to the ground, the woodcutter wept bitterly. Why had he forgotten the deer's advice? Why hadn't he waited just a little longer? But no amount of regret could bring back his wife and children. He sat there for a long time, crying until the moon rose high above the mountains. When he finally returned home, the little hut felt painfully empty. Everything was just as it had been: the spot where the fairy used to sit and weave, the floor where the children had played, the table where they had shared meals, but his family was gone. From the next day on, the woodcutter went to the pond every morning. He sat by the water, gazing up at the sky, calling the names of his wife and children, hoping they might somehow hear him and return. But only the clouds drifted slowly by, and there was never an answer. At night, he counted the stars, imagining that somewhere beyond them, his wife and children were living in the heavenly world. One evening, he sat once again by the pond, looking up at the bright moon. Though it shone just as it had the night the fairy first descended, it no longer looked beautiful to him. The woodcutter missed his wife and children so much that his heart could hardly bear the pain. Just then, he heard a faint rustling sound and a familiar figure appeared before him. It was the very same deer whose life the woodcutter had once saved. The deer had been watching the woodcutter's sorrow from afar and had come back to help him. "The next time the full moon rises," said the deer gently, "a bucket from heaven will descend into this pond. Climb into it, and it will carry you up to the heavenly world." The woodcutter listened intently, his heart filling with hope. A few days later, the night of the full moon arrived. The woodcutter waited anxiously by the pond, his eyes fixed on the sky. At midnight, a brilliant light shone down from above, and a large bucket slowly descended from the heavens. Carefully, the woodcutter stepped inside. The bucket began to rise, lifting him higher and higher into the night sky. Through the drifting clouds and past the glittering stars he went, never taking his eyes off the heavens. His heart pounded with excitement at the thought of seeing his beloved wife and children again. After a long ascent, a dazzling palace appeared before him. It was the heavenly realm. He saw magnificent towers, a clear pond, and wondrous flowers blooming everywhere. Then, to his great joy, the fairy and their 2 children came running to him, throwing their arms around him in tears of happiness. Even the Jade Emperor, who ruled the heavens, had heard of the woodcutter's kind and faithful heart. Moved by his goodness, the emperor allowed the woodcutter to live in heaven with his family forever. The woodcutter lived peacefully in heaven with the fairy and their 2 children. But as time passed, he began to miss his mother, who was still alone on earth. Whenever he looked down through the clouds, he saw their small mountain hut and imagined his mother waiting for him in loneliness. His longing grew deeper each day, and he became thin and weak from sorrow. Seeing this, the fairy understood his heart and decided to help. From the heavenly stables, she brought him a beautiful white horse with shining wings. Handing the reins to him, she spoke gently but firmly. "Ride this horse down to see your mother," she said. "But remember, no matter what happens, you must never step off the horse." Overjoyed, the woodcutter climbed onto the winged horse. With a powerful flap of its wings, the horse soared through the clouds and descended swiftly to earth. When he reached the yard of his old hut, the woodcutter called out loudly, "Mother! It's me, your son has come back." Hearing her son's voice, the old woman ran out barefoot, unable to even put on her shoes in her haste. She held her son's hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. When the woodcutter said he must soon return to heaven, his mother's eyes filled with sorrow. "At least have a bowl of warm pumpkin porridge before you go," she pleaded. She hurried into the kitchen and brought out a large bowl filled with steaming golden porridge, made with love. The woodcutter, still seated on the horse, began to eat, savoring each spoonful. But suddenly, a drop of the hot porridge spilled onto the horse's back. Startled by the heat, the horse reared up sharply. The woodcutter lost his balance and fell to the ground. Without its rider, the white horse spread its wings and soared back into the sky, disappearing among the clouds. The woodcutter stood there, stunned, staring upward. He realized he could never return to heaven again. From that day on, he was filled with deep sorrow. He grew weaker and weaker, longing for his beloved wife and children, until at last, he passed away. It is said that he was reborn as a rooster. Every morning, the rooster looks up at the sky and cries out, "I must go. I must go." To human ears, it sounds like cock-a-doodle-doo. But in his heart, he is still calling out to his family in heaven. Even now, the rooster's cry is said to echo with the woodcutter's longing for the sky. A promise made should always be kept. See you next time with another warm and magical story from long ago.